use that knowledge to find ways of preventing these diseases. So the body of work I'm going to show you this afternoon was a team effort. You can see on the slide there that there are many other people involved in this work at universities and institutions across Australia. And our task was to take a snapshot of the amount of cancer occurring in Australia each year, and we chose the year 2010, and then to try and work out how many of these cancers might be preventable if we know what is causing them. So that'll be the sort of theme of this presentation. So I'm going to go through some background. I'm going to talk a little bit about the methodology because some of the concepts might be a little abstract for people. And then I'm going to just walk you through some of the key causal factors for cancer, those exposures that cause cancer, and explain to you how we calculated the numbers of cancers that are due to those exposures. And then at the end, I'll try and wrap it all up within about 45 minutes. So I guess it'll be well known to all of you as public health physicians and trainees that cancer is common in Australia and New Zealand. In fact, Australia and New Zealand have, on average, the highest rates of cancer in the world. And this graph just shows you in blue for men and in the salmon pink for women, both the incidence of cancer, that is the number of new cases per year, and also the number of deaths for men and women in Australia and New Zealand. You can see that we have the highest incidence of cancer in the world in these two countries, particularly for men, and our death rates aren't quite as high as other places, which is a good thing. So if you put that into actual figures, about 120,000 new cases of cancer are diagnosed each year in Australia, about 22,000 new cases in New Zealand. So, you know, it's a common condition when considered across the board. And just in comparison with the other broad categories of disease burden in Australia, for men and women, you can see that cancer is about a third of all years of life lost. So this is years of life lost, as you know, is just one measure of disease burden, and it incorporates both premature death and also the rate of death from each class of disease. So you can see that for both men and women, cancers now account for more premature deaths and greater numbers of lives lost than cardiovascular disease, than injuries, than mental illness, than other categories. So clearly, as a class of diseases, cancers are very important in this country. And when you just drill down a little bit further, we all know that cancer is just not a single disease. It's a disease process, occurs in organs throughout the body. So just refreshing ourselves on what are the cancers that occur most commonly in Australians, you can see that for both men and women, the commonest cancers are the hormone-dependent cancers. So that's prostate cancer in men and breast cancer in women. About 20,000 new cases of prostate cancer per year in Australia, and 14 to 15,000 new cases of breast cancer. So those two are by far and away the most common cancers amongst Australian men and women. And then the next three cancers are the same for men and women. So it's bowel cancer, melanomas of the skin, and lung and bronchus cancers. And then you can see that after that, the numbers drop down quite dramatically. And so then there's a range of other cancers at other sites that occur at relatively lower frequency in both men and women. So you can see the top four cancers there account for the bulk of all cancer diagnoses in Australia. So as public health practitioners, when we're thinking about how we might try and deal with this problem of cancer, there's a bit of jargon that we have. So if we think about a timeline for people starting at birth and going through to death, there are various points in that journey, in that life journey, at which you can intervene to try and control cancer. And we tend to break this up into the period before the onset of cancer, the interval between the onset of cancer and the diagnosis of cancer, and then things that we can do after someone's diagnosed. And so the jargon that we have is that if we're trying to actually prevent cancer developing in the first place, this is primary prevention. This requires a knowledge of the causal factors and try and minimize exposure to those factors in the population. Secondary prevention is all about bringing forward the time of the diagnosis of cancer, trying to catch cancers as early as we can in the hope that catching cancers early or diagnosing them early will lead to better outcomes because the treatment will be more localized, there'll be less morbidity, and we can therefore extend life. And then tertiary prevention is really about preventing premature death from cancer. and that's where we use the new therapies as well as traditional therapies like radiotherapy and chemotherapy to try and target the cancer cells, kill the cancer cells, preserve the host, preserve quality of life, and prevent death. So that's the sort of jargon that I've been using in this presentation. And really what today's talk about is this end of the scale, primary prevention. That is trying to estimate how many cancers are caused by factors in the environment that we can control, that we can potentially modify, and if we can do that, how many cancers might we prevent in the first place. And just thinking about our health system, it's disproportionate actually, the efforts that we put into controlling cancer. So in Australia each year in direct health costs, it's about $4.5 billion is spent on treatments, and many of those therapies actually have of dubious value, but we spend an awful lot of money on tertiary prevention. We spend less than 1/10 of that on screening programs, and there are really only 3 cancers for which we have national screening programs, and the investment in those is quite limited. And it's really not known how much we spend on primary prevention, but it's again probably an order of magnitude lower again on primary prevention. And just when we think about the magnitudes of these things, I mean, by the time people develop cancer and have to go to hospital, it leads to an awful lot of admissions to hospital. So we're getting up towards 1 million hospitalizations each year in a country of 23 or 4 million people for cancer. And when you look at the leading causes of hospitalization for cancer in this country, it might surprise many of you to know that in fact the leading cause of hospitalization is for treatment of non-melanoma skin cancer. And many of these are day procedures, but a fair proportion of them in fact are more involved procedures. Cancers of unknown primary site, although not all that common, they do actually take up a lot of hospitalizations. And then you've got prostate, bowel and breast cancer. Now, as a public health practitioner, you'll immediately look at that list and say, well, gosh, a lot of these cancers potentially might be prevented. And there are certainly some on that list that you would say, gosh, we know the causes for many of these, why don't we focus more on prevention? And these are the ones that I've struck out here. So clearly we know causes for non-melanoma skin cancer. There are a multitude of causes of bowel cancer, breast cancer, lung cancer, and bladder cancer. So even just targeting those cancers alone and targeting the exposures that cause those cancers, one would predict that you could reduce the burden on the health system. The question is, how much would you reduce that burden? And so we were commissioned by the Cancer Council Australia, which is a non-government organisation that is essentially a cancer charity. They have a public health committee, and they commissioned a report in which they wanted us to estimate the numbers or the proportions of cancer cases that are preventable. And they wanted us to do that for the most up-to-date year that we could do. So in fact, we chose the year 2010. That's the year for which we have the most recent cancer incidence data. So what are we trying to do? So the way in which you estimate how many cancers are due to an exposure is by calculating a measure called the population attributable fraction. Now, there is a definition of this, and those of you who've done postgraduate studies in epidemiology, and I guess many of you will have done an MPH or something similar, will be familiar with this term. And really, it's the population attributable fraction is the ratio of the difference in incidence between the incidence of cancer as it occurs in the population versus the incidence in an unexposed population. So we might say the incidence of lung cancer in the whole population, take away the incidence of lung cancer amongst people who've never smoked, and take that as a proportion of the incidence of lung cancer in the whole population. And that gives you an estimate of how many cancers in the population are arising due to that exposure. So to show you how this might work graphically, I've got a series of cartoons here that divide the population into those people who are overweight. And so just for the sake of argument, we might say that 40% of the Australian population is overweight and 60% are in the healthy weight range. In fact, those proportions are probably actually reversed now in Australia, but just for the sake of argument and for demonstration of how this works, these are the numbers that we'll just play with here now. So we know that in the population, people who are overweight have a relative risk of cancer that's about 1.5 times higher than people who are in the healthy weight range. So we say overweight is a risk factor for cancer, it increases the risk by about 50%. So when you multiply that across the entire population, what you actually see in terms of number of cases is that in the entire population, you will see that the rate of cancer amongst the people who are overweight is indeed 1.5 times higher than the people who are healthy weight. And what we're trying to do then is to estimate, well, how many of these cancers have occurred because of the fact that people are overweight. So to do that, we know that there are, in this example, 120 cases of cancer in that population. But in fact, 100 of those cancers would have occurred anyway. There's a background rate of cancer in the population, and that background rate occurs both in the healthy weight and the overweight people. And it's really only the excess cases that we're interested in as being attributable to cancer. So to make the calculation, to calculate the population attributable fraction, this is the sum, or this is the actual calculation. It's the number of excess cases over the total number of cases in the population. So in this example, it's about 17% of cases we would say are attributable to being overweight. So the key thing here is that the population attributable fraction is dependent on both the relative risk amongst the exposed people as well as the proportion in the population that are exposed. So there are two factors at play, both the prevalence and the relative risk. And so there are ways of doing this mathematically in populations, and we don't need to go into the details of what this calculation looks like, but basically you need the relative risk, you need the prevalence of exposure, and you do that across all levels of exposure in the population. So if you have people of normal weight, overweight, obese, and very obese, there are different relative risks for each of those categories. There are different proportions of people in those categories, and you need to know that distribution in order to calculate this attributable fraction. So in terms of doing this globally for all cancers in the Australian population across all exposures, you need to understand exactly which of these exposures are causal. So for this assessment, we used independent agencies, so that's the World Cancer Research Fund and the International Agency for Research on Cancer, as well as on occasion the US Preventive Services Task Force. These are external agencies that do systematic reviews of the literature. They collate molecular and animal data, and they determine whether or not an exposure causes cancer, and they make that as a declaration. So we use those assessments. As I mentioned, you do need to get prevalence data for the Australian population, so to work out how many people in Australia are actually exposed to the agent in question. So for much of that information, you can use the Australian National Health Survey, but there are other national collections of data that capture prevalence information. Active Australia runs physical activity surveys. The Australian Bureau of Statistics has various collections, and so we use those wherever possible, but sometimes certain exposures are not captured very well. You'd be surprised possibly to know that many medication or pharmaceutical exposures are not well collected on an individual basis, and so then you need to use population-based epidemiological studies and grey literature to get those data. The other part of the equation is obtaining the risk estimates. That is, how much is a person's risk increased by being exposed to a certain factor. And so we use the same sources as for the determinations of causality. So both the WCRF and IARC have presented meta-analyses where they have systematically reviewed the literature and derived summary or pooled estimates of risk associated with those exposures, and by and large we use those. And then there are some differences to those formulae which I can explain a little bit later on. So the assessments of causality, as I said, were undertaken by international external agencies, but this is just to remind those of you of an epidemiological bent of this chap, Austin Bradford Hill, and his philosophical reasoning and his 9 key attributes that are required in making an assessment of causality. And so I'm just reminding you of those. You need to consider the strength of the association between the exposure and the outcome. How consistent is that observation across studies? Is it specific? Do you see specific relationships between certain types of exposure and certain types of cancer? Temporality implies that the exposure must occur before the onset of disease, so there can only be a one-way temporal relationship. you must consider the biological gradient. This is not a hard and fast thing, but typically for many exposures like smoking, alcohol, obesity, you tend to see increasing risks of disease with increasing levels of exposure to those agents. And then these other ones, plausibility, coherence, experiment, and analogy, really are delving into the non-epidemiological literature, into the molecular and animal data to say how well do these observations match what we see in other areas of science. And so those sort of considerations are undertaken by both WCRF and IARC. They publish monographs, and that's where we took our causality statements from. And so this just gives you the matrix of the various factors we considered. So we looked at about 13 different factors. So tobacco, alcohol, UV radiation, and infections. Then a couple of exposures relating to metabolism, so that is obesity and low physical activity. A suite of 4 dietary factors, so low intakes of fiber, low intakes of fruit and vegetables, and high intakes of red meat or processed meat, and then some reproductive and hormonal exposures. And so you can see that tobacco has been causally associated with 13 different cancers, and those cancers are listed to the right-hand side there. So you can see that the digestive tract cancers and respiratory tract cancers and reproductive and urinary cancers have been associated with tobacco. There are 6 different cancers associated with alcohol, and you can see the numbers down there. And so for every single one of those exposure cancer couplets, we've had to calculate separate PAFs, or population attributable fractions, for all of those things. There are a couple of other methodological issues before I just start sharing the data with you, and these are important things to consider. We know that cancers don't arise immediately after exposure. We know that for many cancers, the latent period is decades long. So, you know, following sun exposure in childhood, melanomas might develop in your 40s or 50s. Following a long history of smoking, cancers will develop in the 60s and 70s. So in terms of trying to work out, well, what period of exposure are we talking about for the Australian population for cancers arising in 2010, we typically looked for prevalence data that occurred in 2000 or beforehand. So what we're seeing now in the year 2010 is really the result of exposures that occurred a decade or more before. And so we spend a lot of time trying to find older prevalence data on the prevalence of those exposures. We also accept that many of the analyses that we undertook have ranges of uncertainty around them. These relative risks that you need to put into these formulae often come with confidence limits, and there is uncertainty around how precise those estimates are. So we conducted a lot of sensitivity analyses, just trying to gauge exactly the best estimates for these attributable fractions. And then we also looked at a measure called the potential impact fraction. And so that is where you can say, well, in the population, a certain percentage of cancers are due to eating red meat. But it would be impractical to require the whole population to adopt a vegetarian diet. And so the potential impact fraction is a measure of saying, well, if you could shift the population average from consuming 100 grams of red meat a day down to 60 grams of red meat a day, or down to 40 grams of red meat per day, how much gain or how much reduction in cancer incidence might you see? What's the potential or the potential impact of these interventions that are targeting particular behaviors, but not to the exclusion of that behavior, but just reducing exposure to that behavior? And so this just summarizes the whole period, the latent period that I just talked about before. Okay, so I'm going to share with you now some of the findings from our actual analyses. So these are the summary data for the 13 exposures, the 13 causal factors that we looked at for the whole of Australia. So plotted out here on the x-axis are the number of cases of cancer per year in Australia that are attributed to each of these factors. So you can see that by far and away in Australia, tobacco is the leading cancer-causing factor, causing about 15,000 cases of cancer per year, or about 13% of all cancers are attributable to tobacco. we see that UV radiation is the next leading cause of cancer. All of these were melanomas, and so you can see that about 7,000 melanomas per year in Australia are directly attributable to the role of UV light. You can see that there are nearly 7,000 cancers attributable to inadequate dietary factors, and I'll explain those later on. And then you can see, moving down the list, overweight and obesity, infections, alcohol, insufficient physical activity, each cause 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 cancers per year. So you can see that these modifiable, preventable environmental exposures cause a lot of cancers in Australia each year. So we'll just drill down now on the particular groups of cancers that these exposures cause. So just starting with tobacco. So as I mentioned previously, tobacco has been declared a cause of about 13 different cancers. So those are cancers of the upper airways and digestive tract, but also the liver, the pancreas, the stomach, kidney, bladder, colon and rectum, some of the reproductive cancers, and many people may not be aware of this, but is also weakly causal for myeloid leukemia. Now, the thing about smoking is that, in fact, there's quite poor records of smoking history amongst Australians. We record very well people's current smoking history in various surveys, but trying to get a snapshot of the population in terms of their past and current smoking and accumulating that smoking history is actually very difficult. So a very bright statistician in Oxford called Richard Peto came up with a method for guesstimating the cumulative smoking history of a population, and he did it by observing the rates of cancer amongst people who are current smokers in this steep red line, amongst people who stopped at various ages, and comparing all of them to this very low-lying line at the bottom here amongst lifelong non-smokers. And so we said, well, there's a background rate of cancer incidence in the population that occurs regardless of whether or not you smoke, and then all of the rest of the cancer, lung cancer burden that you see is attributable to the smoking history of the population, both past and current smoking. And so by observing this ratio of the proportions of cancers amongst current smokers and never smokers, you can infer or deduce the cumulative smoking history of that population. So this is referred to as the Peto method. It's not essential that people understand this, except to say that it has wide plausibility and has been used in studies around the world. The important thing is, once you've been able to establish what the cumulative smoking history of the population is using the lung cancer data, you can then apply that notional smoking prevalence in the population to the relative risks for other smoking-related cancers, and thereby work out how many of those other cancers are due to smoking. And so just to show you what that means in practice, so here's the various cancers that have been associated causally with smoking, but you can see that smoking has different relationships to these cancers. So by far the strongest effect is seen for cancers of the lung, with a relative risk of about 21 for men who smoke, and a relative risk of about 12.5 for women who smoke. And these are far and away the highest relative risks for any of the cancers associated with smoking. But you can see there's also high relative risks for oral cavity and pharyngeal cancers, for esophageal cancers, for laryngeal cancers, and then there's a step down to other cancer sites that are more distant from the mouth, stomach, the bowel, the liver, and these are, considerably lower relative risks, but they're still elevated risks. And so these are the relative risks we use for these analyses. And so when you multiply those up by the Australian population, you can see that about 10,000 men each year develop cancer directly as a result of tobacco smoking, either past or current. And for women, there's about 5,000 cancers amongst Australian women. And so this just shows you in red, the numbers of cancers for each site that are attributable to smoking. So it's about 6% of all bowel cancers for men, and about 85% of all lung cancers for men. And so, for each of these sites, there is a proportion, either greater or smaller, of those cancers that is due not to smoking, but to other factors explained or unexplained. But you can see that the proportion of cancers that are attributable to smoking is what is the ratio between the red and the blue. And that's how we get these percentages down the side here for both men and women. So just showing you that in numerical terms, for the lung, it's about 8,200 cases per year. There's about 1,800 oral cavity cancers, 900 bowel cancers, 800 esophageal cancers, and then a large number of cancers at other sites. So clearly tobacco is a major cause of cancer at many different body sites in the Australian population. So just changing now to alcohol. Alcohol's been causally associated with 7 different cancer sites. So that's the mouth and upper airways or upper pharynx, the liver, squamous cell cancers of the esophagus, female breast cancer, and colorectal cancer. And again, these associations are probably not widely understood amongst the medical community, while some of them would be, particularly liver cancer, esophageal SCC, and maybe the oropharynx. It's probably less widely appreciated that female breast cancer is causally associated with alcohol, and that bowel cancer is as well. And just showing you the magnitude of these risks. So without going into details, measuring alcohol consumption is a tricky business, and it's done in different ways in different studies. But the way in which studies try to summarize this information is to look at the excess risk of cancer per gram of alcohol per day. And so knowing that there's about 10 grams of alcohol in one standard drink, and many drinkers drink several standard drinks a day, these relative risks quite rapidly escalate. And so what you can see here is the highest relative risks for body sites, the oral cavity and esophagus, and then the risks are much lower for bowel cancer, for liver cancer, and for breast cancer, but they're not zero, and they do accumulate over time. So it's just showing you the distribution of alcohol intake in Australian men. This comes from the 2001 National Health Survey. And so just eyeballing this, people might be surprised by the large proportion, this is in men, the relatively large proportion of people who declared they are not drinkers. So this survey is a little unusual compared to many surveys, but it's probably the most complete. But it asked people whether they've had a drink in the last week, and if so, how many drinks have they had on the last 3 days that they drank. So if you didn't drink in the last week, you'll put into this category here, the none category, the lowest category. And I'll talk about that a little in the sensitivity analyses. But you can see then that amongst the people who do drink, there's quite a range of drinking intakes, and that range varies according to age. And the ages are plotted here on this Z-axis. So you've got the youngest people at the front in blue, incrementing upwards in 10-year age groups until you get to the over 75s at the back there in grey. And so you can see there's a bit of a hump in the middle sections here, people drinking 1 to 2 drinks per day. This is for Australian men. And then there's quite a long tail of men who drink 3, 4, 5, 6 or more drinks per day. And just so that you can anchor yourself, the NHMRC and various other bodies in Australia suggest that for safe drinking, men should drink less than 2 standard drinks per day. So that's the cut point on the distribution. People to the right of that cut point are drinking in excess of recommended drinking levels in Australia. So just looking at the proportion of cancers, so for men there's about 2,000 cancers per year attributable to alcohol. In women it's about 1,200 cancers per year. The sites with the highest numbers are the colorectum, that's the bowel, and the oral cavity, and with the highest attributable fraction is the larynx in men. But you can see that in women, the biggest and most frequently caused cancer from alcohol is breast cancer. And this just gives you the numbers here, about 800 breast cancers per year in Australia attributable to drinking amongst women. So as I mentioned before, this lower category of drinking probably doesn't represent actual abstainers. It probably represents people who have low drinking intakes. So we had access to other data sets that suggested that we could redistribute these people in the bottom category. And so we did that, and we redistributed these people amongst lower categories of drinking here, and just to see what impact that might have on our assessments. So we've redistributed all those people into safe drinking levels, but not zero drinking levels. But it makes almost no difference when you run your eye down this column, which is where we had the primary analysis for each of the cancers. And if you redistribute those people in different ways, you can redistribute them according to different algorithms, but it makes almost no difference to the attributable fraction. So we don't believe that there's an underestimation of drinking intake that seriously impacts on the attributable fraction. So what would be the impact then if you can't get the whole population to abstain? What if you could shift everybody down to the safe drinking level? You depopulate these higher drinking categories and you shift everyone into this 2 drinks per day category. What would be the impact? And this is where this potential impact fraction comes in. So that would result, we estimate, in 1,400 fewer cancers in Australia each year, a big reduction in the number of bowel cancers, a reasonable reduction in the number of breast cancers and oral cavity cancers. And maybe if you can't even do that, if you can just shift people down from the upper drinking categories to 4 standard drinks per day or less, you would still see some sizable gains in terms of prevented cancers, both for the bowel and the oral cavity and pharynx. So, you know, these data give you some idea of where you could invest preventive strategies and what the impact of that might be. So just quickly moving to some of the other exposures that we looked at, we know that overweight and obesity are a cause of a number of different cancers. Again, this is probably not widely appreciated in the clinical community, but it's rapidly gaining traction in the cancer prevention community. So we know that esophageal adenocarcinoma, gallbladder cancer, some reproductive cancers, as well as female postmenopausal breast cancer, pancreas, kidney, and colorectal cancer are all causally associated with being overweight or obese. There are mechanisms that are well understood for this. The important thing here is not to understand the mechanism, but to say that obesity causes cancer in different ways at different tissue sites. And it can act through metabolic pathways, growth factor pathways, inflammatory pathways, and also through estrogenic and hormonal pathways. So if people are interested, I would encourage you to look that up. But there are certainly many different ways in which carrying excess body fat can increase your risk of cancer. And it does so at quite high rates, actually. So the strongest associations are seen for adenocarcinoma of the esophagus and endometrial cancer. And so amongst people who are obese, there's more than a doubling of risk compared to people who are non-obese, or in fact in the normal weight range. And then there are different estimates of risk for different organs by sex, which are documented here, and you can see what those risks are. Just showing you the distribution of body mass in the Australian population by age and sex. So we have males in the left panel, females in the right panel, and from top to bottom we have the oldest age groups down to the youngest age groups. Those in blue are in the healthy BMI category. That's less than 25 kilograms per meter squared. So you can see at younger ages, you know, despite what you might see in the media, most of younger people are actually in the healthy weight range, and there's a proportion of them obese. As you move into middle age, particularly, that's where you start to see that, you know, less than half of men and about half of women are in the healthy weight range, and there's quite a large proportion of men and women in those age groups who are overweight or obese. And so how does that convert into numbers of cancers? Well, you can see that the sites which have the largest number of cases attributable to body mass, to excess body mass, are the postmenopausal breast cancer in women. About 8% of all breast cancers are attributable to body fat, and about 10% of all colon cancers, 19% of kidney cancers, and then the 2 sites with the highest relative risks, endometrial cancer and esophageal adenocarcinoma. About 1/4 to 1/3 of those cancers are attributable to the prevailing levels of obesity in our population. And so, you know, in total, there's about nearly 4,000 cases per year in Australia attributable to overweight and obesity. And these are just the numbers that I just outlined before. About 1,000 colon cancer cases, another 200 rectal cancer cases, and then you've got breast, endometrial, and kidney cancers, all with more than 500 cases per year. So obesity and overweight is a sizable, pardon the pun, a considerable cause of cancer in the Australian population. And then just closing out with some of the dietary factors. And there's now causal evidence that red meat and processed meat, insufficient dietary fiber, insufficient fruit, and insufficient vegetable intakes are causally associated with some digestive tract cancers, and also for lung cancer associated with inadequate fruit intake. So the Australian National Nutrition Survey has undertaken surveys, and in fact these are the most recent survey data for the Australian population. They're now 20 years out of date, but they're the best we have. There will be some new recent National Nutrition Survey data coming out very soon, in fact probably just released from the most recent survey, but there was a 20-year gap. But basically, back in 1995, 94% of Australian men exceeded the recommendation of 65 grams a day of red meat or less, and about 50% of women exceeded that recommendation. In the Australians in 1995, the average intake of fruit was 1 serve a day when the recommendation is to have 2. There was insufficient intake of vegetables on average, and 70 to 80% of Australian men and women had low intakes of fibre that did not meet their daily requirements. So you can see the dietary intakes of Australians predispose them to cancer. And you can see the size of the relative risks. They're quite small, but they're not zero. And so there are different effect sizes for the different sites of cancer associated with fruit and vegetable intake and for fibre and red meat. So again, for the purists, the numbers are there, and they can be looked up in the papers that I'll give you to review later on, but just to show you the background workings of them. And so this just plots out or quantifies the numbers of cancers at each site. So for cancers of the bowel, about 1/3 of all cancers of the bowel are attributable to these dietary factors. So for the colorectum, there's about 3,000 cases due to the meat intake of Australians, and then about another 1,000 cases, or 1,500 cases, due to insufficient fibre. And then you can see that for these other cancer sites, the role of diet is quite small, but it's not zero. And these are essentially, these cases that have occurred are essentially preventable with better dietary composition of the Australian population. And so you can see that there's altogether in Australia about 6,600 cancers due to dietary factors. Meat is a big player in that. Fibre also contributes to a lot of cases, and then the fruit and vegetables is slightly smaller, but not insignificant for these various cancer sites. So one of the exercises that we can do is this population attributable fraction, and that's trying to estimate the impact on cancer incidence if we could have changed those dietary intakes back in 1995. And so we might be able to shift red meat consumption. So how would we do that? Well, we would have to shift this huge distribution at these upper intakes here and try and get the Australian population, all these meat eaters here in these brown columns, right back to these levels here in the yellow that you can just see tucked away in that bottom right-hand corner of the graph. If you could do that, then you might be able to prevent about 800 cancers per year in Australia from those sites, the colon and the rectum. And if we could get people to eat their fruit and vegetable intakes by increasing their fibre, then that would reduce the number of cancers of the colorectum by about 1,300 cases per year. So there are definitely steps we could take. These may not be achievable in the short term, but they give you an idea of how many cases you might be able to prevent by modifying dietary patterns. And so then just quickly running through the other sites that I won't go into in detail. So as I mentioned, these UV radiation caused cancers were all melanomas. For infectious causes of cancer, quite a few cancers in Australia. People may not fully appreciate that this happens. A lot of these are HPV-related cancers, so cancers of the cervix, cancers of the head and neck through oral sex, anal cancers, and vulval and vaginal cancers. So quite a few from HPV. Helicobacter pylori causes nearly 700 stomach cancers per year. Excuse me. We have quite a problem with hepatitis B and hepatitis C. And we estimate that causes nearly 500 liver cancers per year. And then there are cancers arising from Epstein-Barr virus infections of both Hodgkin's lymphoma and nasopharyngeal cancers. So you can see that infectious agents, viruses predominantly, cause quite a few cancers in Australia. And then there are cancers arising from these hormonal exposures. So, excuse me, from postmenopausal hormones or hormone replacement therapy, about 450 breast cancers each year from past use of hormone replacement therapy, and some endometrial and ovarian cancers. And then insufficient duration of breastfeeding. So this is a difficult one to estimate, but requires quite involved calculations. But the recommendation is that following each birth, women breastfeed for at least 6 months and up to 12 months to give optimum protection against breast cancer in the future. And so many women breastfeed for shorter durations than that, and so you can estimate the numbers of cancers that might have been prevented had there been longer durations of breastfeeding, and the estimates come up at about 235 cases per year. So again, not an insignificant number of cancers due to these modifications. And so then just quickly, we talked before about the attributable fraction. The prevented fraction is a very similar concept, but basically what it's trying to estimate is how many cancers would have occurred in our population but didn't occur because the population is already doing things that prevent cancer. So the things that we're talking about here, and there are 4 different exposures that we're talking about. Aspirin use is highly prevalent in the population, and we know that prevents colorectal cancer and esophageal cancer. We know that many people use sunscreen every day, and we know that prevents melanomas and squamous cell cancers. And we know that the oral contraceptive pill is very common amongst women of childbearing age, and that reduces the risk of ovarian cancer. So it's trying to estimate what's the missing gap here of cancers that would have occurred, except that they didn't because people were adopting these behaviors here. So when you look at that, here are the 4 agents that we're looking at: aspirin, sunscreen use, oral contraceptive pill, and menopausal hormone therapy, which, while it does increase the risk of breast cancer, actually considerably lowers the risk of colorectal cancer. So there are swings and roundabouts in some of these exposures. You can see the effect sizes for these agents for the different cancer sites, and you can see the prevalence of these agents in the Australian population in the column just here to the right of the agent. And so the final calculation here is then, well, how many cancers would have occurred but didn't because of these agents in the population? So the big numbers here that you can see, that the use of sunscreen in the population is reasonably high, and that, we believe, has led to the prevention of about 1,700 melanomas that would have occurred but have not occurred because people are using sunscreen, and about 14,000 SCCs of the skin. So rates of SCC of the skin would have been about 9.3% higher than they otherwise are because of sunscreen use in the population. And you can see that the oral contraceptive pill is preventing about 1,300 cancers per year in women, cancers of the ovary and the endometrium. So that's given you a bit of an overview of the entire process. So overall, when you sum up all of the cancers prevented across all of the cancer sites, both in men and women, we estimate that about 1 in 3 cancers that are occurring in the Australian population, or 32% of all cancers, are potentially modifiable if we could reduce or prevent the exposures that cause them in the Australian population. We did some secondary analyses, so where we looked at associations between these 3 factors: overweight and obesity, insufficient breastfeeding, and hormone replacement therapy for other cancer sites that have not yet been declared causal but are likely to be declared causal in the next little while. But in fact, including these extra cancer risk factor associations made almost no difference. It would lead to a 1% higher estimate of the attributable fraction. So we believe that whether you include these or don't include these, it makes almost no difference to the estimate of the attributable fraction. So then when you just look at the top cancer sites in Australia, in the Australian population for which there are cases that are preventable, these are the sites of cancer where we can really do something. Lung cancer, by preventing smoking, you could reduce the number by more than 8,000. Bowel cancer, and as you can see, it's multifactorial, caused by obesity and dietary factors, fiber, alcohol, and smoking. So many factors to act on there, but you could reduce the number of bowel cancer cases by about 7,000. Melanoma by adopting widespread sunscreen use and avoidance of excess sun exposure. Breast cancer, again, multifactorial, and these other cancers are predominantly smoking, alcohol, and Helicobacter related. And then just looking at the actual cancer sites with the highest preventable fractions, it's another way of looking at it. It's not absolute numbers, it's relative numbers. So there's about 5 cancers for which the attributable fraction is greater than 80%. These are largely infectious related cancers, so cervix, Kaposi's sarcoma, and anal cancer. And then you've got these 2 smoking related cancers, laryngeal cancer and lung cancer. So by targeting those very specific exposures, we could reduce the incidence of those cancers by more than 80%. And there's a bunch of middle-ranking cancers here where you could reduce by half or more. And these, again, are cancers that are related to infections but also to smoking. And then down here, cancers with lower attributable fractions, but even so, you could make a sizable dent on the cancer burden. And some of these cancers are associated with very high mortality, such as pancreatic cancer. So, you know, these are cancers that would be amenable to prevention in the first instance. And just closing out then with, of those cancers that I showed you at the very start as being the most common cancers in men, how many of them are preventable? And this is quite a sobering slide in some ways, in that the most common cancer in men, prostate cancer, has no known modifiable causes. So there's really, at this point in time, no preventive or primary prevention strategies that will target prostate cancer. But then for the other cancers coming on the list, so melanoma, lung, and colon cancer, and then these sort of middle-ranking cancers here, you can see that there are sizable gains to be made in cancer prevention through known risk factors. For women, about the same sort of story. Breast cancer, you could reduce by about 1/4. Colon cancer, melanoma, lung, and endometrial, you can make sizable impacts on all of those cancers through targeted preventive strategies. There are some cancers that you can't do anything about at this stage. Thyroid cancer, which is rapidly rising in incidence but has a good prognosis, at this stage has no known modifiable risk factors. So we published these in the Australia-New Zealand Journal of Public Health last year. There were 14 back-to-back papers. Those papers are freely available, online, open access, so you can go to the ANZ JPH website and download all of those papers. It generated an awful lot of media interest, and particularly in the print media, and we believe that's had a strong impact. But it's certainly been adopted also by the Cancer Council. So there are things we can do now. We want to also look at the burden of cancer due to mortality, disability, and cost, and estimate how much we might be able to prevent those cancers. We want to look at this population impact fraction or potential impact fraction, and this is a sort of a time course or time series analysis that we want to do, looking at how much money it would cost to do these interventions, to get people to change their behaviours, and what sort of return on investment might you get by doing that when you can target these particular behaviours that we know cause cancer. And so I'm just going to close out here. This is my favourite picture in the Queensland Art Gallery. And so you might think, what has this got to do with cancer or cancer prevention? But in fact, this drawing comes from the early 1900s, when Brisbane was pretty much a shanty town, and it's under a jacaranda tree in the Botanical Gardens. And if you look very closely here, the man and the woman are unlikely to be candidates for getting cancer. So they both wear hats and have fully clothed, even though it would be November in Brisbane, so they're protected from ultraviolet radiation. They're very likely to be abstemious, or certainly the lady is, and to not drink alcohol. The man might drink moderate amounts. They almost certainly have diets that are high in fruit and vegetables and low in meat. They would have walked their way to this rendezvous. They certainly haven't had a car, so they're probably much more physically active. They're definitely not obese. And they're unlikely to exchange infectious viruses like HPV. At least I've been told that the woman would be very chaste. The man himself in the early 1900s may not have been. But all in all, they would have been non-smokers as well. So likely to have low rates of cancer. They may well have died of other things, injuries, accidents, what have you. But in terms of cancer prevention, this might be the model that we could adopt and go back to in the years ahead. So I'll close out there. I just want to really thank the team of people who assisted me in this enterprise. So we had a list of chief investigators who would be known to some people, prominent public health physicians and cancer epidemiologists, and then a team of associate investigators as well. And I'll be very happy to answer any questions now in the next 5 or 10 minutes if people have any, or people can shoot me off an email, and I'd be happy to try and answer any questions that you might have. So I'm not sure how this process works